Now, I imagine that you all are familiar with the fable of the emperor's new clothes. You've heard this one, right? A story about an emperor living hundreds of years ago, very rich and powerful. And one day, two foreign merchants came to his court, and they offered him a very interesting deal. They said, "We have magical thread, magical looms, and magical sewing needles. And with these special looms and needles and thread, we can make beautiful clothing, exquisite clothing." And it has a very interesting feature. Only the wise, only the discerning, only the smartest people can see this clothing. The stupid and the foolish can't see it. To them, it is invisible. Well, the emperor was rich and powerful, and he was used to getting fancy things, and this interested him greatly. And so he commissioned them to make him a custom set of these magical clothes, beautiful but only visible to the wisest people. A few weeks went by, and the merchants showed up, and they walked in seeming to carry clothing, but when the emperor looked, he didn't see anything. He was immediately embarrassed. They had told him that only the wise could see these clothes. He immediately worried that he wasn't smart enough, wasn't wise enough to see the magical clothes. He did not want to publicly admit that he was not wise enough to see the clothes. And so he pretended to see them. He paid them their money and then had his assistants dress him in these invisible clothes. Well, his assistants and his administrators, his courtiers, none of them could see the clothes either. But of course, they went along and pretended too. None of them wanted to admit that they couldn't see the clothing. I think each of them was suspicious that there was nothing there, but what if they were wrong? What if they said, "I don't see anything," and everyone else laughed at them, mocked them? The emperor decided to double down on his commitment to pretending he could see these clothes, and he announced a great parade to show off the beautiful set of clothes he had just purchased. So he took off his existing clothing, put on the pretend clothes, and marched through the city. Population lined the streets, and they had all been told the details. The emperor has these beautiful new clothes, but you can only see them if you are very wise. Everyone played along, whether out of embarrassment that they couldn't see things, or simply out of fear. It's generally not a good idea to mock the emperor. But eventually, as the emperor turned a corner, a young child pointed and said, "Oh my gosh, the emperor's not wearing any clothes." In that moment, the ruse was up. In that moment, everyone realized that something was wrong here. And this is a famous fable that goes back at least 800 years in European folklore, and there's actually a very similar story in the Indian folklore tradition as well. And it's interesting to consider why someone would make up this story. How could it be so old? What inspired people to tell a story about an emperor who was too proud to admit that he had paid money for nothing and that he was walking around naked? And it seems that for a very long time, our world has been full of people claiming to have great wisdom. Some people really are, of course, wise. Some people really do have expertise in their field, and we should listen to them. But this story is pointing to a simple and obvious, if uncomfortable, fact that a lot of the people claiming to be wise are really just trying to sell us a new set of invisible clothes. This story had me thinking about a much more recent and historical example of, I think, this exact same behavior. Some of you may have heard of a company called Theranos. Theranos. Anyone in person? Theranos, does this ring a bell? Okay, a few folks. All right. Theranos was founded in 2003 by a woman named Elizabeth Holmes. And Holmes had this amazing idea. She wanted to revolutionize the field of blood testing. I'll take another quick poll. Who here has ever had to get blood drawn for a test? Doctor's office? Yeah, everyone, right? And you know how it is, right? I had to get some routine blood tests a few months ago. I went to LabCorp, right? And they took 7 vials of blood from me. 7 vials for just some basic routine tests. Whenever you're giving blood, you have to look and see it happening. You're like, oh my gosh, am I going to be able to walk out of this room, right? Holmes knew our discomfort with this process, and she thought, well, what if we could do blood tests, not by drawing vials of blood, but just with a finger prick, right? Some tests can indeed be done this way. Those of you who are diabetic may often use such a technique. She thought, well, what if we could use this technique to test everything for all blood tests? And what if we could go further? What if we could actually create a machine that would automate the testing? You wouldn't need to pay someone to do the tests. You would have a machine, you would have your finger pricked, the machine would run the test quickly with a computer and would give you the results in a few minutes. This would be incredible, right? Not only would we have to have less blood drawn, it would be faster, more convenient, easier, cheaper, and potentially more accurate. Indeed, Holmes envisioned putting these special blood testing machines all over the place so that when you needed a blood test from your doctor, it just took you an hour to go get it done and you were all set. Indeed, this idea caught a lot of people's attention, and by 2012, 2013, Holmes had received the better part of $1 billion in funding, and her company was valued at least $4.5 billion. That's billion with a B, 1,000 million, okay? $4 billion. It was clear that people thought this was a great idea, and they trusted that Holmes had this technology all set to go. Indeed, both Safeway and Walgreens at certain points placed her test units in their stores and allowed their customers to actually use the machines. Holmes was being seen and clearly saw herself as the next Steve Jobs, the next Bill Gates, this revolutionary genius who was going to bring a new technology to our lives that would change everything for the better. And it all sounded great until it was revealed to all be a complete lie. The machines did not work. The tests did not work. It turns out that there are physical and chemical reasons that you need so much blood for blood tests. The machines were a fraud. None of the tests were valid. And eventually, that came to light. Holmes, who was positioned to be this powerful billionaire, is now serving an 11-year prison sentence for, among other things, wire fraud. Often, this is what the wisdom in our world looks like. The problem is that we humans will often believe anything as long as we think we can make money off of it, right? The truth of the matter is that scientists and doctors had been questioning Holmes' claims from the beginning. People who actually worked in the field of blood testing said, wait a second, we've all tried to reduce the amount of blood we need for testing, and it's never worked. Show us the details of how this is supposed to work. And those were never provided. And so these doctors and scientists were publishing articles and contacting the media and saying, look, there's something fishy going on here. We don't think this is real. People didn't listen. The investors didn't listen. The media didn't listen because everyone really wanted to believe in this. And everyone, well, not everyone, but a number of people stood to gain a lot of money from this. What is presented as wisdom is often foolishness, well-marketed foolishness, but foolishness nonetheless. And these two examples, the fictional Emperor's New Clothes and the story of Theranos, of course, are not limited examples. History is full of Ponzi schemes, snake oil salesmen, people who try to separate us from our money by giving us nothing, thinking we're getting much more than nothing. These deceptions and these cons, I think, work very often because we are so focused on the possibility of making money, of becoming powerful, of getting prestige. We humans are often blinded by our greed and selfishness. And this constant commitment to becoming rich and powerful and prestigious is often what passes as wisdom in this world, right? We often assume that if you're wealthy, you must be wise. Not that long ago, our nation elected a president pretty much on this principle. And we got to see in real time the results of this idea. I ask you in 2023, do you believe that if you are wealthy, you must necessarily be wise? I think the data suggests not all the time. We humans, though, we're so confident in our predictions, so sure in our expectations, right up until the moment when those expectations are reversed. And our wisdom is revealed for what it is: foolishness. Now, what I think is interesting is I think all three of our scripture passages today are speaking to this reality, speaking to this fact that what we take as wisdom is often much less than wisdom, that those who claim to be full of wisdom are indeed full of something, but it's not wisdom. But since I know that you'd like this sermon to end before noon, I'm going to focus just on our letter from Paul, our second reading on page 5. Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth. Paul is talking to the Corinthians about the cross of Christ. Right? He understands the Christian proclamation as centering on the cross of Christ. And he knows that it's kind of a tough sell, the cross of Christ, right? We're worshiping a man who was killed by the government. He was poor and powerless. According to the wisdom of the world, Jesus was a fool. And yet here's Paul saying, commit your lives to following this man. Paul knows he has to explain why this is worth doing. And he begins actually by quoting Isaiah. Right in that first paragraph, he quotes Isaiah. And Isaiah says this, and Paul quotes him, quote, I will destroy, that is God. God will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning God will thwart. Right off the bat, Paul questions the received wisdom, the common wisdom of the world. That wisdom will prove to be foolishness. And indeed, Paul then goes on to say something pretty incredible a little further down. Paul says this, quote, God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom. God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Again, Paul understands, more than anyone, Paul understands that the proclamation of the gospel, this story of the cross of Jesus, looks foolish. Paul himself persecuted the church earlier in life. He rejected Jesus' teachings. He rejected the cross of Christ until his strange experience on the road to Damascus. Again, Paul was the first person to insist that the church worships a poor man executed by the state, powerless, and at his death, essentially friendless, abandoned. And indeed, note that we understand this man to be God. So let's be honest about what we're saying. God came into the world, and then God was arrested and killed on the cross. God died on the cross. That's the message of the church. It sounds pretty crazy. It sounds pretty foolish. Paul recognizes this. But what he's come to realize is the uncomfortable truth. The uncomfortable truth taught us by the fable of the emperor's new clothes. The uncomfortable truth taught us by the story of Theranos. The wisdom of the world is often well-marketed foolishness. Leaders in business and government, and often in spirituality, leaders are often like the emperor or his assistants, pretending that everything is going well, pretending to be wise, when in fact they are not. Paul, in other words, is the child, standing by the roadside, pointing at the emperor and pointing out the obvious. That's the thing. The promise of Christian faith is not that we will become rich. It is not that we will become powerful. It is not that we will become respected or even comfortable. And if you don't believe me, I encourage you to look again at page 6 at all the people that Jesus said are blessed. It's not the powerful, the prestigious, the rich, or the comfortable that Jesus says are receiving the kingdom. The promise is not that God will fulfill the wisdom of the world. It's not that God will somehow give us what we want, that power, that wealth, that prestige. No, the promise is that God will reveal the foolishness of the world, will reveal that what appeared to be wisdom was in fact not wisdom. God's goal is to reveal that foolishness. Although luckily for us, God's goal in revealing that foolishness is not to judge us for our foolishness, no, but rather to save and to transform the world in all of its foolishness. That the bankrupt wisdom of the world can be redeemed for the genuine wisdom of God. What Paul is offering, of course, is a life not lived according to the wisdom of the world. Not a life lived in pursuit of wealth or power or prestige, but a life lived in pursuit of love, of solidarity, of kindness. Committing ourselves to lives of love, of solidarity, and kindness, this appears foolish according to the wisdom of the world. It did in Paul's day, and it does today. There are many people today who think it's foolish to ever give anyone anything for free. There are people who assume the only point of life is to make number go up in your bank account. But that's all life can be about. That is the wisdom that governs our world. Paul, Jesus, God is offering a very different view and revealing that a life lived only in order to become wealthier and more powerful and more prestigious is ultimately a life committed to emptiness and nothingness. Paul is not the first or the last person, of course, to make this point. Consider the prophet Micah on page 4. At the very end, through Micah, God tells us what we're supposed to be doing. God has told you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? Doing justice, loving kindness, walking humbly will not make you wealthy or powerful. You don't become CEO of anything by loving justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly. It's a different set of values. It's a different understanding of wisdom. And if we find ourselves convinced by the gospel of Jesus, then these are the values. This is the wisdom we are committing to. But, if we are going to give our lives to this crazy, foolish way of life we call the gospel, we need to admit something. Our expectations will be reversed. We are often the courtiers in the emperor's court, expecting one thing, assuming that wisdom is one thing. So many of the things we take for granted, God will reveal as nonsense. And what we least expect, what we least are willing to believe in, even if we hope for it, may turn out to be the deeper truth. That is what Paul is pointing out about Christian discipleship. Our expectations for how the world is supposed to work will be overturned. Something else will be given and shown to us. God is a child, pointing out that the emperor indeed has no clothes on. Will we accept this plain truth, or will we keep pretending? The choice is ours, my friends. I pray we make the truly wise decision. May it be so. Amen.